Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 12 of series 11. The question we're asking for today is, can a value imperative be established for ethics, morality, meaning and purpose? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, chapter 2, section 9. We have been criticizing theories of ethics in order to learn from them as well as to show their inadequacy. This is because principles of ethics are values that are supposed to guide moral action, and theories of ethics thereby provide extensive knowledge about the nature of value. This is important for our philosophy of life that proposes a solution in terms of value. That is, an affirmation or will to value leading to a certain sufficiency of value. Implicit here is a primacy of value that has been sought in different ways in both philosophy of life and in ethics. In a philosophy of life, value has been noted as key to religion, romance, meaning, purpose, and aesthetics. But it has been thought utopian to search for a single comprehensive principle, even for ethics, and thought of as a futile search for the Holy Grail to cover all these value-based activities. Yet that is what I will argue for today, but in the form of an ethical value imperative. And I ask for this enterprise to be judged by its evidence, not its reputation. We saw that one of the most concerted attempts to establish an ethical principle was Kant's categorical imperative. That is, he required the construction of a universal maxim that must be affirmed due to reason and by duty. But it is widely thought that his categorical imperative is only a hypothetical imperative, that is, effective only on the addition of seemingly a non-cognitive motive. Yet as well as Kant's search for a coherent principle, there were many other notable features in his theory. These included a deference to human subjectivity that he saw in reason as a universal human capacity, as well as a need for freedom and quality of moral intent, the idea of constructivism and the legislation of one's own principles that we will draw upon today. But we have seen that most other theories of ethics don't even provide a precise formal principle. That is, theories of ethics are usually constructed on the basis of intuitively appealing principles and ideas that are either invalid or thought to be out of reach. In the case of Aristotle's virtue theory, the principle of eudaimonia, or human flourishing, is a sophisticated synthesis of happiness and the moral satisfaction resulting from right conduct. But his conception of the virtues were based on natural and human conventions that lacked both valid principles and an adequate account of value theory. Yet again, as we have seen, virtue theory provides both a conceptual framework and an account of virtues that can be employed in value theory ethics. I've also argued that utilitarianism crucially fails to explain moral intent by reason of explaining ethics in terms of consequences, and because it sees its objectives in terms of happiness. Yet happiness is both a human good and a form of sufficiency that helps to explain value sufficiency. The failure of these and other theories is one of the many difficulties that stand in the way of a value imperative. Yet their particular associations with the four kinds of mental state, cognition, affect, will and value, highlight both their difficulties and a possible solution in terms of value. That is, Kantian ethics is predominantly cognitivist, that incurs such difficulties as Hume's law or principle that a prescriptive moral ought cannot be derived from a factual is. And utilitarianism prioritizes the affect state of happiness that incurs the problems of More's naturalistic fallacy of confusing the pleasant and the desirable with the moral. Virtue theory also had difficulties with naturalistic groundings and social facts. The will is sometimes thought to be a basis for ethics in such forms as the will to power or the will to will. But both the will to power and the will to will are forms of control or capability, and as such they don't specify any particular mental state that would bring moral satisfaction, or explain how they would be expressed in plausibly moral action except in terms of egoism or dominance. The difficulties of these and other theories, based predominantly on the states of cognition, affect and will, together with the problems posed by human more, indicate an opening for value theory. But that remains to be demonstrated, together with other difficulties that need to be overcome, such as the inclusion of subjectivity with a form of universality, a way of inescapably engaging the moral will, yet conditional on different states of awareness, that is also non-naturalistic, constructivist, self-justifying, and produces plausible outcomes and relations with other people. These requirements of a value imperative have yet to be explained and vindicated. I list them above in order to give some idea of the task before us, and the accomplishment of this task, if achieved, shouldn't be underestimated. But before tackling these issues, we need to understand what it is about value that does what we need it to do. To begin, value is just another mental state, like cognition, affect and volition, but with particular properties. That is, cognition provides fact and reason, affect describes phenomenal experience, and the will or volition provides the motivation to act. Yet value and values also have their own properties and possibilities that we can outline here and discuss later. These include being the base or key state of morality, meaning and purpose, as well as other institutions like romance and religion. Value also provides an independence or sufficiency of value in states like courage, moral fortitude and love, that can be explained by comparison and contrast to the sufficiencies of happiness and pleasure, yet with the added capacities of meaning, purpose and the why of life. Yet unlike cognition, values necessarily engage the will, because to value something is to want it or to will it. And values can engage the will in the pursuit of objectives regulated by adaptable ideals like the will to truth, the good will, the will to will, that are eventually inescapable for a reflectively conscious creature that is valuing and willing. And such regulation also provides normativity for certain values. And properties like the will to truth, the good will and sufficiency provide another sought after quality, that is, the quality of self-justification, because not to value value is self-defeating, self-negating and contradictory. But again, before discussing these properties of value, I want to outline its underlying ontology. And I will do this in two ways. One is a phenomenological analysis, another is by empirical observation. I previously given this phenomenological account of the ontology of value several times. That is, Heidegger cites care as the being of Dasein, and Sartre writes that the being of the self is value. He says that reflective consciousness cannot arise at the same time without disclosing values. Sartre wants to trace choice as selection and thereby value back to its ontological foundation. He writes that choice isn't just a preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. He says that every choice supposes elimination and selection and selection are expressing the values of disfavour and approval or preference. I've also previously illustrated this idea with the example of the contrast of a black spot on a white background. That is, a monotone is inimical to selection, choice and value, as well as to perception and consciousness. So diversity and contrast is essential to and produces consciousness, perception and value. This argument also shows that cognition is also fundamental to consciousness, but as explained here and elsewhere, cognition can't do what value is able to do. Yet the underlying ontology of value can also be shown by empirical observation. That is, the underlying drive of value can be observed in practically every human activity, and it seems unextinguishable in the ubiquitous needs of self-esteem, meaning, purpose and morality. Yet like any other fundamental drive, it might be repressed but not extinguished. We can also note the work of Philip Pettit and Geoffrey Brennan on the problem of motivation and normative values. They do this by supplementing contractualism and social contract theories with a social interaction theory. Their view is based on the idea that people desire the esteem of others and shrink from their disesteem, unquote. And this certainly seems to be a greater influence on motivation and commitment than just social agreement or rational deliberation. And they go on to associate their view with an intellectual tradition that includes Adam Smith, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, the Baron de Montesquieu, David Hume, and they say just about everyone who is a forebear of modern social and political theory. But leaving aside the criticism that social esteem produces systems that may not be moral, like that of Vikings and Nazis, social esteem is a powerful force that presupposes the power of self-esteem as an expression of value. Given that these brief discussions have established value as a deep underlying motivating force in human life, we still haven't answered the crucial question of how can it be normative or ethically coherent, or why we should definitively choose value rather than cognitive, affective or volitional goals. Yet we can begin to do that now with the idea that value has internal forms of regulation, and one of those regulators is the idea of truth. Yet truth in ethics is often understood as access or even a priori access to an objective underlying reality. But it is widely accepted that there is no absolutely objective reality that can be described as truth. And even if such truth existed, it is convincingly argued that it could not establish moral values. Yet the concept of truth is also thought indefinable with interesting consequences. Bernard Williams, for instance, quotes Donald Davidson as saying that truth is, as G.E. Moore, Bertrand Russell and Gottlob Frege maintained, and Alfred Tarski proved, an indefinable concept. Yet Kant, Popper and others define truth as a regulative idea because it's unknowable but offers corrections of falsity. Yet there are even more powerful correctives in the idea that truth is systematically incomplete. One of these is the idea of truth as a systematically incomplete value draws us towards further truth. Another idea is of a symmetry between incomplete truth and the nature of moral virtue. That is, the incompleteness of truth as both an objective and a supporting cognitive framework or idea corresponds with an account of moral virtue as eschewing unwarranted cognitive or social support, as in moral fortitude, magnanimity, courage, and of course the goal that is value sufficiency. Truth can thereby be thought of as something that imposes consistency on our values. Yet there is more to this symmetry between truth and moral values. To explain it, one aspect of More's naturalistic fallacy was that the moral good cannot be adequately defined. I disagree that we can't define the character of the moral good, which I do define in terms of value. But I agree that we cannot definitively define the highest moral good. This is because, again, like truth, the good is always liable to reformulation and further discovery. Yet again, like truth, the moral good is an object of an agent's highest aspiration. And I want to show that the moral good derives normativity from a direction towards this aspiration. And this direction can be found in Nietzsche's reassignment of Socrates' idea that man always acts for the good, that is, his own conception of good. Yet I've previously argued that the indefinability of both truth and the highest moral good is fortuitous. It is fortuitous because truth and the highest moral good share a property that regulates values, and that property is possibility, incompleteness, or absence, which beckons value to further value. Yet an absence or attenuation of cognition has other implications for value. That is, an absence of social endorsement, such as in the case of moral fortitude. What we see here is that value and moral value are related to truth and have a certain symmetry. That is, both morality and truth not only have inescapable claims on our will, but are both indeterminable, and that their normative functions derives from their direction, not their immediate content, and that the conception of truth employed here has a regulatory effect on moral values. So in the search for normativity, truth and moral value share the same feature of indeterminability, and this symmetry of truth and moral value leads to them evoking similar kinds of value. This is because values are largely determined by the objects that they value. The outcome isn't just that truth is an ideal and a regulative constraint for value, but that incompleteness, in the sense given, is a criterion of both truth and value, and that incomplete cognition, as argued elsewhere, is a catalyst of value. But more needs to be said on the establishment of normativity and moral coherence. This is because the traditional criteria of normative values, like divinity, nature, social convention, fact, reason, genetics, and happiness, have failed. Various reasons, as well as such failures, lead to moral philosophers looking for forms of self-validating ethics. Bernard Williams, for example, writes that Nietzsche rightly claims that morality, in this wide sense, demands to be understood as self-sufficient. And Ronald Dworkin speaks of a positive aspect of Hume in an independent realm of value. Yet all these references are about morality, or value in general, not about specific values. To explain the context of this, self-validation can be established in logic and mathematics by non-contradiction, but a priori or self-validating principles are not thought to be possible in physics or ethics. Yet with respect to value, I prefer the term self-validation or self-justification rather than a priori. This is because the term a priori has epistemological connotations. For example, logic is determined by the self-evident and self-validating truths of Aristotle's 4 basic principles of logic. David Hilbert described mathematics as avoidance of contradiction and is therefore a self-validating a priori. And a self-validating system within the human sphere is Descartes' I think, therefore I am. physics isn't self-validating because it's an a posteriori system of contingent observations. Importantly, mathematics and logic are self-validating but can't establish principles for systems of physics or ethics. Conversely, if systems of value can be self-validating or self-justifying, their criteria of validation or justification should also be able to offer criteria of value. By way of illustration, Heidegger describes the will to will in a similarly self-validating way. He writes that the will to will forces the calculation and arrangement of everything for itself, unquote. And the will to will also provides an introduction to the will to value that I propose here. Yet Kant unexpectedly seems to agree when he says that we have then to develop the notion of a will which deserves to be highly esteemed for itself and is good without a view to anything further, unquote. Yet this is consistent with one of his famous statements that nothing can be conceived in the world which can be called good except the good will. But just prior to this statement, Kant had written that such an end should be determined by reason only. And he follows by saying, to do this, we will take the notion of duty, which includes that of a good will. But it's highly contested that reason can determine final moral objectives, and his principle of duty has also been largely rejected as an adequate moral motive. My solution lies in a principle of value as an affirmation of value or will to value or the value of value, and that such is self-validating as called for by Nietzsche, Williams and Dawkins, because the alternative, not to value value, is self-defeating, self-negating, contradictory, regressive and erroneous. And beginning this process with value avoids the problem of deriving ought from is. I should first explain that the will to value, as the value of value, isn't a tautology, as might be thought. It isn't a tautology because value can affirm value, or value value, as it can affirm or value any other mental state. It can do this due to the capacity of reflective consciousness that can be applied to itself. Robert Nozick agrees that we can and should value values, or perhaps even value value. We can begin with the idea that not to value value is contradictory because value must be affirmed by its own system of value in order to value anything within that system. The argument is similar to the I think therefore I am, which must presuppose I am in order to think. And the ubiquity of value argued elsewhere also presupposes a ubiquitous will to value, and therefore not to value value is contradictory. Yet not valuing value can be self-contradictory in different ways that can be described as regression. As above, not valuing value is a denial of the capacity of value by which you are denying value. Not valuing value can be a denial of an aspect of consciousness which we can't escape. And not valuing value can be a denial of some positive principle which is regressive. An illustration of such regression is found in Sartre's repudiation of the spirit of seriousness as a denial of choice. The spirit of seriousness is to take subjective values as objective to avoid freedom, responsibility and choice. The classic case of this is to say in bad faith and inauthenticity that I have no choice. Now, choice and freedom are prerequisites of value, and their denial can be taken as regressive. It's regressive because it goes back to conditions when those capacities are absent. Yet denials of such capacities is also a form of self-negation because these capacities constitute what we are. That is, we are essentially conscious beings that can be described as consciousnesses. But as we have previously argued, consciousness isn't a transcendental or ethereal entity. It is all our mental states, and especially, as phenomenologists say, our values and choices. So to deny these capacities is to literally deny or negate crucial parts of ourselves. And not to value value is self-defeating, because value is the key component of primary aspirations and satisfactions. That is, not only in religion, romance and aesthetics, but also in morality, meaning and purpose. And many thinkers, as myself, has explained and argued for these capacities in terms of value. Yet also argue for a culminating state of human satisfaction in the form of value sufficiency. So not to value value is to defeat our primary objectives that lie before us. And lastly, not to value value is erroneous, because it involves mistaken beliefs about the nature of consciousness, the objectivity and character of value, and what might constitute culminating human objectives in such forms as social conditions, psychological states, happiness, and even morality. All the above discussions present at least two kinds of validation or justification. One is because the alternatives are contradictory, self-negating, self-defeating, or invalid. Another is due to the character of the state or due to the characteristics that we can now discuss. The first of these is the value sufficiency that results from the will to value and is thereby also self-validating. Yet it is required that value sufficiency is indeed sufficient in itself, which has certain implications, and these implications have real life consequences, such as the noted self-validating ethics and substantive experiences of meaning and purpose that, as argued elsewhere, can ameliorate the problem of death as a removal of a prospective future. This is because, in principle, value sufficiency is sufficient in itself. I next want to consider universality as a criterion of justification for either value or moral value. Universality is central to Kant's categorical imperative as a criterion of ethics and morality. And it seems that something must be universal in order for ethics or morality to be viable, or we have to contend with the ethical inversion posed by Sartre's character Jean Genet: good be my evil, evil be my good. One question is whether, and crucially how, universality refers to the material content of particular actions, or whether it is referring to the formal content of an underlying principle. We can dismiss universally fixed morality of particular actions like the Ten Commandments. But Kant's universality also refers to the material content of action that's problematic in a complex and diverse world. This is because universality, as determining correct action in every conceivable circumstance, is unattainable. But there's another question here of whether universality is even a legitimate criterion of morality. Kant might escape this question by prioritizing intention and goodwill as the only thing that's good in itself. But his conception of intention and goodwill depends upon the compliance of the will to conform to the content of a maxim that has been chosen because of its universality. So Kant doesn't provide either a subjective account of intention, as we might want, or an escape from criticisms of cognitive foundations or of universality. I want to use a distinction here that I make between ethics and morals. Grayling and Dworkin make another distinction. Mine is between subjective moral intent and objective ethical judgments that we might want to make. On this view, Vikings may be moral because they don't know any better, but are unethical because we do know better. That is, value theory ethics provides such a principle that is both subjective moral experience and is universal as an inescapable property of consciousness, when there is awareness of it. I previously explained how that awareness and conformity to it is potentially inescapable. This is my solution to universal ethical requirements in a diverse moral world. One property that helps to explain this conditional universality is a value imperative, is that of constructivism. Constructivism is the self-explanatory idea of making or fabricating something rather than discovering it. A version of constructivism is unexpectedly found in Kantian ideas of freedom and legislation of our own maxims. But existentialism speaks of creating values that I would reserve for making something out of nothing. J. Wallace gives a critique of social constructivism as a way of establishing normative values. That includes John Rawls and Tim Scanlon as ultimately failing to engage the will. But the value imperative that I propose would engage the will by virtue of being a value held by an agent. The instantiation of such value and its conditions of application have been argued for in this paper, and the existence of conditions of application, as well as the working out of the material content of particular actions in value theory ethics, amounts to a form of constructivism. One of the strengths of constructivism is that it rightly does not accept predetermined ideals, as postmodernists insist, as automatically appropriate to particular individual circumstances, but it requires an ideal that the individual can identify with as his own. We saw an example of such constructivism in the earlier case of truth and the good being undefinable, yet they are still subject to the normative direction of a will to value as the pursuit of truth and the good. And other ideals like courage and honesty can be similarly constructed according to requirements, with the consequence of having a special and unrelinquishable meaning for the agent. An analogy would be to a DIY construction of one's own house that couldn't be simulated by a direct purchase. Everything in the house, or in a house of ideas, has a deeper meaning and value than a presentation of ideas. And the house that I'm talking about is the house of value theory ethics in the practice of value. So constructivism isn't just a philosophical method, it is also an aspect of meaning. Yet there are other properties or criteria that might potentially help establish a value imperative, in addition to the non-starters I listed much earlier that I discuss in another workshop. These include possibilities like coherence, consistency, subjectivity, quality and choice, as well as less likely properties like freedom, intrinsic value and a cost theory of value. Intrinsic value isn't an adequate value imperative because it is a relative and not an absolute value. Yet G.E. Moore and Robert Nozick determine both priority and intrinsic value with its degree of organic unity. But for reasons below, I think that organic unity would be better described as coherence. Nevertheless, on Moore's and Nozick's view, higher degrees of organic unity are of higher intrinsic value. But as Nozick points out, organic unity can also be a property of negative events, that is, in the form of concentration camps, wars, and heinous plans to commit evil. But there is also the problem that some of these unities are external structures, and as they are external, they don't necessarily represent values. Yet as an internal property of value, coherence still offers a relative priority. Consistency is a possible criterion related to the idea of coherence that implies coherence over time. Yet consistency here means reduction of psychological ontological or theoretical gaps or fissures, but it might be easy to start with examples of internal inconsistency, such as anxiety, alienation, guilt, bad conscience, and Festinger's cognitive dissonance. Yet other examples are found in Sartre's concepts of inauthenticity, bad faith, and the noted spirit of seriousness. And these already engage the moral will, but in the avoidance of choice and freedom. Conversely, consistency consists in a synthesis and integration of values, but this seems impossible given diversity of life and a fundamental plurality of values. Yet a degree of synthesis is possible given access to a central principle of value. Freedom is a feature of both Kantian ethics and existentialism, together with authenticity and responsibility. But freedom is a precondition of moral value rather than its determinant, as existentialists claim it to be. And the contingency of freedom as a cultural preference challenges it as an essential criterion. That is, value, meaning and purpose can be experienced in the absence of freedom. So these considerations rule out freedom as being necessary to a value imperative. Other possible features of a value imperative, like subjectivity and quality of choice, are practically presupposed. That is, features must be subjectively experienced in order for them to be able to determine values. And quality of choice is another way of describing an appropriate form of subjectivity. In this respect, it's interesting to note Robert Pirsig's discovery of the principle of quality in his book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Pirsig sees quality as excellence in life experiences and human artifacts, but he fails to name quality as an aspect of value or as a value state. Lastly, another ambiguous property of a value imperative is that of cost as a criterion of value. That is, does a cost always have to be incurred in order for a substantive value to be established? It seems so in commerce, psychology, Christian atonement, or Sartre's theory of value as lack. But we have cases of value not incurring cost, for example, love, magnanimity, and value sufficiency. So some of these features of value can be considered as inadequate and misleading, pointing away from more appropriate criteria of a value imperative. So my conclusion is that both for and against traditional positions, a value imperative can indeed be established. We saw that the traditional foundations of reason, happiness, or virtue were not sufficient to establish a value imperative because they neither engage the will nor at an adequate level. We also found that properties like sufficiency, universality, intrinsic value, coherence, consistency, freedom, cost theory value, subjectivity, and quality are of mixed validity in establishing a value imperative. Yet the conditional nature of even some of the more indispensable properties was both explained and exemplified as subjects of constructivism. More significant was that not to affirm or value value is self-defeating, self-negating, contradictory, regressive, and erroneous, due to the inner drive, character, and ramifications of value and value states. Some of these were expressed in a symmetry between a will to truth and the will to value that are eventually inescapable impulses of the human will. Yet these can also provide a trajectory for value that can be chosen and lead to a certain independence or sufficiency of value. The outcome is that we are confronted by an array of properties and criteria of value of varying significance, which can't simply be taken ready-made off the shelf, but chosen and produced by human beings. Yet all the time they must lie within the parameters of consciousness and the possibilities of value, and the particular actions and material consequences of these must be worked out through a value theory ethics in subsequent workshops. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com. I'm interested in knowing whether you think that I have made a contribution to human thought, or if not, where have I gone wrong?